On May 5, 1945, an American soldier climbed a 400-foot cliff on the island of Okinawa. He carried no rifle, no pistol, no grenades. He refused to kill anyone. Yet by the end of that day, he would save 75 lives under constant enemy fire, becoming one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. His name was Desmond Doss, and his story would challenge everything the military believed about courage, faith, and what it meant to be a warrior. Before we discover how one man's unwavering conviction changed the course of battle, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story of Desmond Doss begins not on a battlefield, but in the humble hills of Lynchburg, Virginia, where he was born on February 7, 1919. The world he entered was still recovering from the Great War, and within a decade, it would be plunged into the Great Depression. Desmond grew up in a small wooden house with his parents, William and Bertha Doss, his older sister Audrey, and his younger brother Harold. The family struggled financially, with William working whatever jobs he could find in carpentry, lumber mills, and construction. Money was always scarce, meals were often simple, and new clothes were a rare luxury. But what the Doss family lacked in material wealth, they made up for in faith. Bertha Doss was a devout Seventh-day Adventist, and she raised her children with an unwavering commitment to the teachings of the Church. Every Saturday, the Sabbath for Seventh-day Adventists, the family attended church services. Every evening they gathered for Bible reading and prayer. Bertha taught her children that the Bible was not a collection of suggestions or metaphors, but the literal Word of God that must be followed absolutely and without compromise. Young Desmond took these lessons to heart in a way that would define his entire life. While other children might hear the Ten Commandments and understand them as general guidelines, Desmond saw them as unbreakable laws. The sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," wasn't something to be interpreted or contextualized. It was absolute. God had commanded it, and therefore it could never be violated, regardless of the circumstances. This conviction was reinforced by a traumatic incident that Desmond witnessed as a young boy. His father, William, struggled with alcoholism, a demon that many men of that era battled as they tried to cope with poverty, unemployment, and the lingering trauma of World War I. One evening, William and his brother got into a violent argument while both were drunk. The disagreement escalated quickly from shouting to shoving to outright fighting. Desmond and his siblings watched in horror as their father and uncle threw punches, crashed into furniture, and seemed intent on seriously hurting each other. Then William pulled out a gun. In that moment, everything stopped. Bertha screamed and threw herself between the two men, pleading with her husband not to do something he could never take back. Young Desmond stood frozen, staring at the weapon in his father's shaking hand. He could see the rage in his father's eyes, could see how close his family was to being destroyed forever. His mother managed to wrestle the gun away, and Desmond grabbed it from her hands. He ran from the house and hid the weapon where it could never be used to hurt anyone. That night, lying in his bed, Desmond made a vow to God. He would never take another person's life. He had seen how easily anger could transform into murderous rage, how a weapon could turn a family dispute into a tragedy. The image of that gun in his father's hand would haunt him for the rest of his life, serving as a constant reminder of why God's commandment against killing was so important. As Desmond grew into a teenager, his commitment to his faith became even stronger. He attended church regularly, studied his Bible daily, and lived according to the principles of his religion. He didn't drink alcohol, didn't smoke, and observed the Sabbath strictly from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. His peers sometimes found him strange or overly serious, but those who knew him well recognized something admirable in his unwavering principles. Desmond was also developing a practical side that would serve him well in the years to come. He learned carpentry from his father, becoming skilled at building and fixing things. He worked various jobs to help support his family, always giving a portion of his earnings to his mother. He was known in his community as a hard worker, honest and reliable. When he made a promise, he kept it. When he committed to something, he saw it through to the end. In 1939, Desmond met Dorothy Shuda, and it was love at first sight. Dorothy was beautiful, kind, and shared many of Desmond's values, though she wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist. Their courtship was sweet and traditional, with Desmond treating Dorothy with the utmost respect and courtesy. He would walk her home from work, take her to church functions, and talk with her for hours about their hopes and dreams for the future. They became engaged in 1941, planning a life together that seemed destined to be simple, happy, and peaceful. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Desmond was listening to the radio that Sunday afternoon when the news broke. Japanese aircraft had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing thousands of Americans and destroying much of the Pacific Fleet. The announcer's voice was urgent, almost panicked, as he described the devastation. Ships burning, planes destroyed on the ground, sailors trapped in sinking vessels. It was the worst attack on American soil in the nation's history. Within hours, young men across America were lining up at recruiting stations, eager to fight back against the enemies who had attacked their country. Desmond's friends and neighbors enlisted immediately. Some joined the Army, others the Navy or Marines. The mood in Lynchburg, like everywhere else in America, was one of outrage and determination. Everyone wanted to do their part, to serve their country in its hour of need. Desmond felt that same patriotic pull. He loved his country and wanted to serve. But he faced a dilemma that none of his friends could understand. His religious beliefs made it absolutely clear he could never kill another person. Not under any circumstances, not even in war, not even if his own life depended on it. The commandment was absolute, and Desmond's faith would not allow him to violate it. Most conscientious objectors, men who refused to fight on religious or moral grounds, chose alternative service. They worked in hospitals on the home front, served in civilian conservation corps, or took other non-combat roles that kept them far from any fighting. Some were even imprisoned for refusing to serve at all. But Desmond didn't want to take the easy way out. He wanted to serve his country in the most direct way possible. He just couldn't kill. The answer, he decided, was to become a combat medic. Medics went to the front lines, faced the same dangers as infantrymen, and served their units in the most critical moments of battle. But their job was to save lives, not take them. As a medic, Desmond could serve his country and his fellow soldiers while remaining true to his religious convictions. It seemed like the perfect solution. His family was horrified when he announced his decision. His father, who had served in World War I and witnessed the industrial slaughter of modern warfare firsthand, begged him to reconsider. "Son, you don't understand what war is really like," William said, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible memories. "I've seen men torn apart by shells, burned alive by flamethrowers, cut down by machine guns. And you want to go into that hell without even a weapon to defend yourself? You'll be killed the first day." His mother cried and prayed, pleading with Desmond to choose alternative service instead. "You can serve at a hospital here in Virginia," she said. "You can help people without putting yourself in such terrible danger. Please, Desmond, I can't bear the thought of losing you." Dorothy was equally distraught. They had just gotten engaged, were planning their wedding, talking about children and a home of their own. Now Desmond was telling her he was going to volunteer for one of the most dangerous jobs in the military, and he was going to do it without any way to protect himself. "What if you're killed?" she asked through tears. "What if I never see you again?" But Desmond's mind was made up. "I have to do this," he told them. "If I don't serve, I'll always wonder if I could have saved lives that were lost because I wasn't there. God will protect me. I have to have faith in that." In April 1942, Desmond Doss enlisted in the United States Army. He was assigned to the medical detachment and sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for basic training. He arrived expecting that his service as a medic would be respected and understood. What he found instead was a nightmare that would test his faith and resolve in ways he never imagined. From his very first day at Fort Jackson, Desmond stood out, and not in a good way. During the initial equipment issue, when each soldier was handed their rifle, Desmond refused to take it. The supply sergeant stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean you won't take it?" he demanded. Desmond explained that he was a conscientious objector who had enlisted as a medic and that Army regulations allowed medics to serve without carrying weapons. The sergeant called over his superior officer, who called over his superior officer, and soon Desmond found himself explaining his position to increasingly angry and incredulous officers. They eventually allowed him to proceed without a weapon, but the damage was done. Word spread quickly through the barracks that there was a conscientious objector in their unit, a guy who thought he was too good to carry a rifle. The other soldiers immediately labeled him a coward and a shirker, someone who wanted the glory of serving without taking any of the risks. The harassment began almost immediately. During drill exercises, soldiers would deliberately march into Desmond, knocking him down and then claiming it was an accident. When the unit did push-ups or ran obstacle courses, men would trip him or shove him. In the mess hall, other soldiers would refuse to sit near him, treating him like he was contaminated. They called him coward, yellow belly, holy roller, and much worse. They made it clear that he was not welcome, that they didn't want him in their unit, and that they would make his life miserable until he quit. The abuse escalated quickly. Someone would hide Desmond's boots before morning inspection, forcing him to stand barefoot in formation while the drill sergeant screamed at him for being out of uniform. His bunk would be accidentally overturned in the middle of the night, dumping him onto the floor. Personal items would disappear. His letters from Dorothy would be destroyed. His Bible would be thrown in the mud. But the worst abuse came at night, when the barracks lights went out and the drill sergeants weren't watching. That's when the physical beatings began. Groups of soldiers would hold Desmond down while others punched and kicked him. They would threaten him, telling him that in combat they would make sure he got shot, maybe by the enemy, maybe by friendly fire, but either way, he wouldn't make it home. One night, someone dropped a heavy boot directly onto Desmond's head while he slept, trying to knock him unconscious or worse. Through it all, Desmond never fought back. Not once, not even to defend himself. When men insulted him, he responded politely. When they hit him, he didn't raise his fists. When they threatened him, he simply said he would pray for them. His refusal to retaliate, to show anger or hatred, seemed to enrage his tormentors even more. What kind of man wouldn't even defend himself? Private Thomas Boone was one of the worst offenders. Years later, filled with shame and regret, he would recall those days. "We did terrible things to Desmond. We beat him up regularly. We destroyed his property. We made his life absolute hell. I personally hit him, insulted him, and did everything I could think of to make him quit. We told ourselves we were doing it to protect the unit, that he was dangerous and would get us killed. But really, I think we just couldn't understand someone who had that much courage in his convictions. It scared us, so we tried to destroy it." Desmond's only respite came on Saturdays, the Sabbath. He would refuse to work or train from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, observing his religious day of rest. This infuriated his drill sergeants, who saw it as more evidence that Desmond thought he was special, that he was getting preferential treatment. They tried everything to force him to work on Saturdays, assigning him extra duties, threatening him with punishment. But Desmond stood firm. The Sabbath was sacred, and he would not violate it. The situation came to a head when Desmond's commanding officers decided they had had enough. They convened a court-martial, charging him with refusing to obey orders and being mentally unfit for service. The Army doctors examined him and concluded that anyone who refused to carry a weapon must be psychologically unstable. His officers testified that he was a threat to unit cohesion and military discipline. It seemed certain that Desmond would be dishonorably discharged. But Desmond had done his research. He knew that Army regulations explicitly allowed medics to serve without weapons. He had documentation proving that conscientious objectors could serve in combat roles as long as they weren't required to kill. His former employer wrote a letter testifying to his character and mental stability. Most importantly, a former commanding officer from his initial training wrote confirming that Desmond was technically within his rights according to military regulations. The court-martial was dropped, but Desmond's problems were far from over. His fellow soldiers still hated him, still believed he was a coward who would endanger them all when they finally saw combat. His officers still thought he was a troublemaker and a liability. Everyone was just waiting for Desmond to fail, to prove that their judgment of him was correct. Then the 77th Infantry Division shipped out to the Pacific Theater, and everything changed. The division's first major combat operation was the invasion of Guam in July 1944. The island had been captured by Japanese forces in 1941 and turned into a heavily fortified position. Taking it back would require brutal fighting against an enemy that had 3 years to prepare their defenses. As the landing craft approached the beaches, Desmond felt his stomach churning with fear and anticipation. This was it. This was the moment when he would finally prove whether his faith was strong enough to sustain him in the hell of combat. The landing was chaos. Artillery shells exploded in the water, sending up massive geysers. Machine gun fire raked across the beach. Men were hit before they even reached the shore, falling into the surf and being swept away by the waves. Desmond jumped from the landing craft and ran toward the beach, his medical bag bouncing against his hip. All around him, soldiers were screaming, dying, calling for help. Desmond saw a wounded man lying in the shallow water, blood streaming from his leg. Without hesitation, Desmond ran to him, completely exposed to enemy fire. He dragged the soldier to cover behind a destroyed landing craft, then quickly assessed the wound. The soldier's femoral artery had been nicked by shrapnel. Without immediate treatment, he would bleed out in minutes. Desmond's hands moved with practiced efficiency, applying a tourniquet, administering morphine, bandaging the wound, all while bullets pinged off the metal wreckage around them. "You're gonna be okay," Desmond told the wounded man. "I've got you." The soldier stared at him in disbelief. He recognized Desmond from basic training, remembered calling him a coward, remembered participating in the abuse. Now this same man had just saved his life, running through enemy fire to reach him. Throughout that first day of combat, Desmond worked tirelessly. He ran from wounded man to wounded man, treating injuries, administering aid, dragging soldiers to safety. He worked without rest for over 12 hours, ignoring his own exhaustion and fear. Other medics were carrying weapons, shooting back when they had to, but Desmond remained unarmed, completely defenseless, trusting in God to protect him. Ralph Baker watched from a foxhole as Desmond sprinted across open ground to reach a wounded soldier. Machine gun fire kicked up dirt all around Desmond's feet. Bullets tore through the air inches from his head. But somehow, impossibly, not a single round hit him. Baker had been one of the soldiers who beat Desmond during training, who had called him a coward and a fake. Now, watching Desmond's incredible courage under fire, Baker felt a wave of shame wash over him. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Baker later recalled. Here was a guy with no weapon, completely unable to fight back, and he was running through machine gun fire like it was nothing. He never hesitated, never flinched. He just focused on getting to wounded guys and saving their lives. In that moment, I realized we had been wrong about Desmond. Completely, totally wrong. He wasn't a coward. He was the bravest man I'd ever seen. By the end of the Guam campaign, Desmond had saved dozens of lives. Men who would have died on that beach, who would have bled out in foxholes, who would have succumbed to their wounds before reaching aid stations, all survived because of Desmond's skill and courage. Word of his heroism spread through the division. Soldiers who had beaten him sought him out to apologize, shamefaced and humbled. Officers who had tried to discharge him now spoke of him with respect and admiration. The unit that had once called him a coward now called him Doc. and they meant it with genuine affection and pride. Men who had wanted him gone now felt safer knowing he was there. If they got hit, they knew Doc Doss would come for them, no matter how heavy the fire, no matter how dangerous the situation. His faith, which they had mocked, had proven stronger than their weapons. But Guam was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come. After Guam, the 77th Infantry Division was sent to Leyte in the Philippines for another brutal campaign. Once again, Desmond distinguished himself under fire, saving lives and earning further respect from his fellow soldiers. The men of his unit now trusted him completely. They had seen what he could do, had witnessed his courage firsthand. But nothing they had experienced so far could prepare them for what awaited on Okinawa. The invasion of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, began on April 1, 1945. It would become the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater and one of the bloodiest battles in American military history. The Japanese had turned the island into a fortress, with over 100,000 troops dug into caves, tunnels, and fortified positions. They were prepared to fight to the death, to make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of ground. Among the most formidable Japanese defensive positions was the Maeda Escarpment, a massive cliff that rose 400 feet and dominated the surrounding terrain. American soldiers nicknamed it Hacksaw Ridge because of its sheer, jagged appearance. At the top of the cliff, Japanese forces had established machine gun nests, mortar positions, and interconnected tunnel systems. They had pre-sighted their weapons to cover every approach. It was, in military terms, a nightmare position to assault. Taking Hacksaw Ridge would require American forces to climb cargo nets up the cliff face, completely exposed and vulnerable, then fight their way through the Japanese defenses at the top. Everyone knew it would be costly. What they didn't know was that it would become the site of one of the most remarkable acts of heroism in military history. On May 4, 1945, Desmond's unit, the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, made their first attempt to take Hacksaw Ridge. The climb up the cargo nets was terrifying. Men clung to the ropes, knowing that if they were hit, they would fall hundreds of feet to their deaths. Japanese soldiers waited until the nets were crowded with climbing Americans, then opened fire. Men were shot off the nets, falling and screaming until they hit the rocks below. Others made it to the top only to be cut down immediately by waiting machine gunners. The Americans who survived the climb found themselves in hell. The top of the ridge was a maze of rocks, holes, and enemy fortifications. Japanese soldiers were everywhere, firing from concealed positions, throwing grenades, emerging from tunnels to attack from behind. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, with soldiers engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat amid the rocks and craters. Desmond moved through this chaos treating wounded men. A soldier with a sucking chest wound, another with his arm nearly blown off, a third with shrapnel in his abdomen. Desmond worked on each one, doing what he could to stabilize them before moving to the next. All around him, men were dying, screaming, fighting for their lives. The American assault eventually stalled under the overwhelming Japanese resistance. Officers realized the position was too strong, the casualties too heavy. The order came to retreat. Soldiers began scrambling back to the cargo nets, desperate to get off the cliff before they were all killed. In the chaos of the retreat, wounded men were left behind. There was simply no way to carry them all down while under such heavy fire. Officers made the agonizing decision that every wounded man left on top of Hacksaw Ridge would have to be considered dead. No one could survive up there alone. But Desmond Doss had other plans. As his unit retreated, as the last able-bodied soldiers scrambled down the cargo nets, Desmond stayed behind. He looked around at the wounded men scattered across the top of the ridge, men who were crying out for help, men who had been abandoned because saving them seemed impossible. Desmond knew what he had to do. For the next 5 hours, Desmond Doss worked alone on top of Hacksaw Ridge. Japanese soldiers controlled most of the cliff top, actively searching for wounded Americans to kill. Bullets whizzed through the air constantly. Grenades exploded at random intervals. It was a killing zone. a place where survival seemed impossible. But Desmond moved through that hell with singular purpose. He would find a wounded man, often having to crawl across open ground to reach him. He would treat the soldier's injuries as best he could, administering morphine for the pain, applying bandages to stop bleeding. Then came the hardest part, getting the wounded man to the cliff edge. Many of the soldiers weighed more than Desmond. Some were unconscious and had to be dragged. Others were delirious with pain, unable to help themselves. Desmond would grab them by their uniform and pull inch by inch across the rocky ground. Sometimes he had to make multiple trips, pulling a man a few yards, then taking cover when Japanese soldiers came near, then resuming once the immediate danger passed. When he finally got a wounded man to the cliff edge, Desmond faced another seemingly impossible problem: how to get them down safely. The cargo nets were designed for climbing up, not for lowering unconscious or severely wounded men. Desmond solved this problem with ingenuity born of desperation. He fashioned a rope sling using a technique he had learned as a boy, a double bowline knot that created a secure loop. He would secure the wounded soldier in the sling, tie the rope to a sturdy tree stump, then carefully lower the man down the cliff face using the rope as a pulley system. It was exhausting, dangerous work. Each man weighed 150 to 200 pounds. The rope burned Desmond's hands as it slid through his grip. His muscles screamed with fatigue. But each time he successfully lowered a man to safety, Desmond would pause, look up at the sky, and pray, "Lord, please help me get one more. Just one more." Then he would head back into the hell of Hacksaw Ridge to find another wounded soldier. The danger Desmond faced during those 5 hours cannot be overstated. Japanese soldiers were everywhere, and they were actively hunting for survivors. Several times, enemy soldiers came within feet of where Desmond was hiding with a wounded man. Once, while treating a soldier with a severe leg wound, Desmond heard Japanese voices approaching. He quickly stuffed a cloth in the wounded man's mouth to muffle his cries of pain, then pulled him behind a large rock. A Japanese soldier walked past, so close that Desmond could see the individual buttons on his uniform. If the enemy soldier had looked to his right, he would have seen them. But he kept walking, and Desmond waited until the footsteps faded before continuing his treatment. Another time, while dragging a wounded man across open ground, a Japanese machine gunner opened fire. Desmond dove to the ground, covering the wounded soldier's body with his own. Bullets impacted all around them, kicking up dirt and rock fragments. Desmond could feel the heat of the rounds passing inches from his head. But when the firing stopped, he got up, resumed dragging the wounded man, and kept going. The soldiers waiting at the bottom of the cliff couldn't believe what they were seeing. At first, they thought the Japanese were playing some kind of cruel trick, lowering dead Americans to mock them. But then the first man reached the bottom, and medics rushed forward to check him. He was alive, badly wounded but alive. Then another man appeared at the cliff edge, being lowered in the same makeshift rope sling, then another, and another. Captain Vernon, who had tried to have Desmond discharged during training, who had openly called him a coward and predicted he would get men killed, stood at the bottom of the cliff counting. 10 men, 20 men, 30 men. The count kept rising. How was this possible? Who was up there doing this? "It has to be Doss," someone said. "Nobody else would stay up there. Nobody else could do this." Vernon felt his eyes fill with tears. He had been so wrong about Desmond. They had all been so wrong. Desmond worked through the afternoon and into the evening. His hands were bleeding from rope burns. His body was covered in bruises from diving for cover. He was exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced. But each time he thought about stopping, each time he thought about saving himself and climbing down, he would see another wounded man, and he would pray, "Lord, help me get one more." By the time darkness made it impossible to continue, Desmond had saved 75 men. 75 soldiers who everyone believed were dead came down that cliff alive. When Desmond finally descended the cargo net himself, His hands could barely grip the rope. He was covered in blood, most of it belonging to other men. His uniform was torn and filthy. He could barely stand. At the bottom of the cliff, his entire unit was waiting for him. Men who had beaten him in basic training, who had called him coward, who had wanted him gone, now stood with tears streaming down their faces. As Desmond stepped off the cargo net, they surged forward, embracing him, thanking him, telling him he was the bravest man they had ever known. Captain Vernon approached, stood at attention, and saluted. It was an unprecedented gesture, an officer saluting an enlisted man. "Private Doss," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you. We were all wrong. What you did today, I've never seen anything like it. You saved more lives than most soldiers save in an entire war." Desmond, exhausted and overwhelmed, simply said, "I was just doing my duty, sir. And I had help. God was with me up there." The men who Desmond saved that day on Hacksaw Ridge would never forget him. Private Glenn Pettis, who had been shot in both legs and left for dead, later wrote, "I was lying there thinking about my wife and kids, knowing I'd never see them again. Then I heard a voice saying, 'Don't worry, I've got you.' It was Doc Doss. He dragged me across that ridge while bullets were flying everywhere, patched me up, and lowered me down that cliff. Because of him, I got to go home to my family. Because of him, I got to see my children grow up." Private Raymond Coley, who had been hit by shrapnel and was bleeding to death, remembered, "I was fading in and out of consciousness. The last thing I thought I'd see was that hellish ridge. Then Doc Doss appeared, like an angel. He worked on me while explosions were going off all around us. He gave me morphine, stopped my bleeding, and somehow got me off that cliff. I owe him everything." But Desmond's story was far from over. 2 weeks after the Battle of Hacksaw Ridge, his unit was involved in another assault on Japanese positions. Desmond was treating wounded soldiers in a forward aid station when someone shouted, "Grenade!" A Japanese grenade had been thrown into the position and landed among the wounded men. Without hesitation, Desmond threw himself toward the grenade and used his body to shield the wounded soldier nearest to it. The grenade exploded, and Desmond took the full force of the blast in his legs and lower body. The pain was indescribable. Shrapnel had torn through both of Desmond's legs, shredding muscle and shattering bone. Blood poured from multiple wounds. Any other soldier would have screamed for help immediately. But Desmond's first thought was for the wounded men around him. Gritting his teeth against the agony, he treated his own wounds as best he could, applying tourniquets and bandages while lying in his own blood. Stretcher bearers eventually reached the position, but there were more wounded men than stretchers. Desmond insisted that other soldiers be evacuated first. "They're hurt worse than me," he said, even though his own injuries were life-threatening. He waited for hours, treating other wounded men despite his own terrible pain, until finally a stretcher became available for him. As 4 soldiers carried Desmond toward the rear, they came under sniper fire. Everyone dove for cover except Desmond, who couldn't move. Lying on the stretcher, he saw another wounded soldier who had been hit by the sniper. The man was crying out for help, his arm blown open by the bullet. Desmond made a decision that defied all logic and self-preservation. He rolled off the stretcher onto the ground. "Give it to him," Desmond said, pointing to the newly wounded soldier. "He needs it more than I do." The stretcher bearers stared at him in disbelief. "Doc, you're bleeding out. You need medical attention now." "I can wait," Desmond insisted. "Take care of him first." So they loaded the other soldier onto the stretcher and carried him away, leaving Desmond lying on the ground with his devastating injuries. He waited there for over 5 hours before another stretcher became available. During that time, he continued to treat his own wounds, reapplying tourniquets when they slipped, managing his pain and refusing to let himself lose consciousness. When stretcher bearers finally returned for Desmond, they were rushing him toward an aid station when another sniper opened fire. A bullet slammed into Desmond's left arm, shattering the bone. The stretcher bearers dropped him in their panic to find cover. Desmond fell hard onto his already injured legs, sending fresh waves of agony through his body. Despite everything, despite the multiple wounds, the blood loss, the unimaginable pain, Desmond remained conscious and alert. He saw a discarded rifle lying nearby, and in a moment of grim irony, he picked it up. Not to fire it, never that, but to use as a splint. The man who had refused to carry a weapon throughout his entire military service now used one to stabilize his shattered arm, fashioning a makeshift splint with the rifle stock and strips torn from his own uniform. When Desmond finally reached the aid station, the doctors were amazed he was still alive. He had lost tremendous amounts of blood. His legs were mangled. His arm was shattered. Shrapnel was embedded throughout his lower body. By all rights, he should have been dead hours ago. The medical evacuation that followed was long and painful. Desmond was taken from Okinawa to a hospital ship, then to Hawaii, then finally to a military hospital in the United States. The wounds in his legs would require multiple surgeries. His arm would never fully heal. And worst of all, while recovering from his combat injuries, Desmond contracted tuberculosis in the hospital, likely from another patient. The tuberculosis was devastating. In the 1940s, there was no cure for the disease. It ravaged Desmond's already weakened body. Doctors had to remove one of his lungs and 5 ribs in a desperate attempt to stop the spread of the infection. For months, Desmond hovered near death. His weight dropped to just 90 pounds. The man who had survived some of the worst combat in the Pacific War was now fighting a different enemy, one that was slowly destroying him from within. Dorothy stayed by his side throughout the ordeal. She had married him in a bedside ceremony while he was still recovering from his combat wounds, refusing to wait any longer after coming so close to losing him. Now she watched helplessly as tuberculosis ravaged her husband's body. The doctors were pessimistic about his chances for survival, but Desmond's faith remained unshaken. He prayed constantly, asking God not necessarily to heal him, but to give him the strength to endure whatever came next. He believed that if God wanted him to live, he would live. And if his time had come, he was ready to accept that too. Slowly, miraculously, Desmond began to recover. It took years, and he would never be truly healthy again. He lived with constant pain from his wounds and from the effects of his tuberculosis surgery. He needed hearing aids because the explosions on Okinawa had damaged his hearing. He could never work full-time again, but he was alive, and he was grateful for every day he had. On October 12, 1945, before his tuberculosis diagnosis, President Harry S. Truman held a ceremony at the White House to award the Medal of Honor to several soldiers who had distinguished themselves in combat. Among them was Private First Class Desmond Doss of the 77th Infantry Division. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. It is given only for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Since the medal's creation during the Civil War, only 3,500 have been awarded. Desmond Doss would be the first conscientious objector to receive it. The citation for Desmond's Medal of Honor read in part, "He was a company aid man when the 1st Battalion assaulted a jagged escarpment 400 feet high. As our troops gained the summit, a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire crashed into them, inflicting approximately 75 casualties and driving the others back. Private First Class Doss refused to seek cover and remained in the fire-swept area with the many stricken, carrying them one by one to the edge of the escarpment and there lowering them on a rope-supported litter down the face of a cliff to friendly hands. As President Truman placed the medal around Desmond's neck, he looked into the young soldier's eyes and said something that Desmond would remember for the rest of his life. "I consider this a greater honor than being President of the United States." Desmond stood there in his dress uniform, still recovering from his wounds, and felt overwhelmed by the moment. He thought about all the men he had saved, all the families that would be reunited because of what happened on Hacksaw Ridge. He thought about the soldiers who had beaten him during training, who had called him a coward, and how they had become his brothers in arms. And he thanked God for giving him the strength to do what needed to be done. The Medal of Honor ceremony made Desmond famous. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the conscientious objector who had saved 75 men without firing a shot. Some hailed him as a hero who proved that courage didn't require violence. Others struggled to reconcile their own beliefs about war and patriotism with Desmond's story. How could someone who refused to kill be a war hero? What did his story say about the nature of courage and service? But for Desmond, the attention was uncomfortable. He had never sought recognition or glory. He had simply done what his faith and conscience demanded. When reporters asked him how it felt to be a hero, he would deflect. "I'm not a hero. The real heroes are the men who didn't make it home. I just did my job." After the war, Desmond and Dorothy settled in Rising Fawn, Georgia, where they bought a small farm. Desmond's health problems meant he could only do light work, but he found peace in the quiet rural life. He raised vegetables, tended a small orchard, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of being home safe with his wife. The men Desmond had saved on Hacksaw Ridge never forgot him. Letters arrived regularly from soldiers thanking him for saving their lives. Some sent photographs of their growing families, wanting Desmond to see the children who existed because of his courage. Others visited the farm, bringing their wives and children to meet the man who had given them a future. Ralph Baker, the soldier who had been one of Desmond's worst tormentors during training, became one of his closest friends after the war. Baker visited the farm every year, and each time he would tearfully apologize for how he had treated Desmond. "I was a fool," Baker would say. "I mistook your gentleness for weakness. I thought refusing to carry a gun made you a coward. I couldn't have been more wrong." Desmond would always forgive him, just as he had forgiven every other soldier who had abused him. "You didn't know," Desmond would say. "None of you knew what God was preparing me for, but when the time came, you trusted me with your lives, and that's what matters." The bond between Desmond and the men he saved became legendary within military circles. In 1955, a reunion was held in Washington, D.C. for the survivors of Hacksaw Ridge. Over 50 of the men Desmond had rescued attended, many bringing their families. It was an emotional gathering, with grown men weeping as they embraced the medic who had saved them a decade earlier. Private Glenn Pettis stood up during the reunion dinner and shared his story. 10 years ago, I was lying on top of that cliff, bleeding to death. I had accepted that I was going to die. I would never see my wife again, never hold my children. Then Doc Doss appeared. He worked on me while bullets were flying everywhere. He dragged me across that hell, and he lowered me down that cliff. Because of him, I got to come home. Because of him, I got to watch my kids grow up. My daughter graduated high school last month. She wouldn't exist without Doc Doss." Other men shared similar stories. Each one spoke of a moment when they thought they were dead, when hope was gone, and then Desmond appeared. They spoke of his calm voice reassuring them. They spoke of his gentle hands treating their wounds. They spoke of his incredible courage in the face of overwhelming danger. And they all spoke of how his faith, which they had once mocked, had been the source of his strength. Captain Vernon, who had tried to have Desmond discharged during training, also attended the reunion. He sought out Desmond privately and said, "I owe you an apology that I should have made 10 years ago. I judged you without understanding you. I thought your faith made you weak. I was wrong about everything. You're the finest soldier I ever served with, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you." Desmond clasped the captain's hand and said, "You don't need to apologize, sir. You were doing your job, trying to build a strong unit. And in the end, we fought together as brothers. That's all that matters now." Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Desmond spoke occasionally at churches and schools about his experiences. He never glorified war or violence. Instead, he spoke about the importance of faith, the power of conviction, and the possibility of serving without compromising one's principles. Young people, especially those struggling with how to reconcile their religious beliefs with military service during the Vietnam War era, found his story inspiring. Desmond's health continued to decline over the years. The effects of his combat wounds, his tuberculosis, and the multiple surgeries he had endured took their toll. He developed hearing loss so severe that he needed hearing aids in both ears. His legs, shattered by that grenade, never healed properly, causing him chronic pain. He lived with only one lung, which made even simple physical activities exhausting. But through it all, Desmond maintained his faith and his positive outlook. He never complained about his disabilities or expressed regret about his service. When asked if he would do it all again, knowing the price he would pay in lifelong pain and disability, Desmond always said yes without hesitation. In 1991, Desmond's beloved wife Dorothy passed away after a long battle with cancer. Her death devastated him. They had been married for 46 years, and she had been his constant companion and support through all his health struggles. Desmond fell into a deep depression, feeling lost without the woman who had stood by him through everything. But eventually, with the support of his friends and his faith, Desmond found a way to continue. He remarried in 1993 to Frances Duman, who had also lost her spouse. Frances helped Desmond navigate his final years with dignity and purpose. Together, they continued to welcome visits from the veterans Desmond had saved and their families. In 2004, a documentary film was made about Desmond's life called The Conscientious Objector. The film brought renewed attention to his remarkable story, introducing a new generation to the unarmed medic who had saved 75 men on Hacksaw Ridge. Young people who watched the film were amazed that such a story was true, that one man's faith could be so strong and that courage could take such an unexpected form. Desmond cooperated with the filmmakers but remained characteristically humble throughout the process. When they asked him what message he wanted people to take from his story, he said, "I want people to know that you can serve your country, you can be brave, you can face danger without compromising your faith. God gives us commandments, and if we follow them, He will give us the strength to do what needs to be done." As Desmond entered his 80s, his health problems multiplied. He required constant medical care and could barely leave his home. But veterans continued to visit, bringing their children and grandchildren to meet the man who had made their families possible. Some of these visitors were the grandchildren of men Desmond had saved, young people who existed only because of the actions of an unarmed medic on a cliff in Okinawa 60 years earlier. These visits meant everything to Desmond. He would sit in his chair, his hearing aids turned up so he could catch every word, and listen to stories about the lives that had been lived, the marriages that had happened, the children and grandchildren who had been born, all because of what happened on Hacksaw Ridge. Each story was proof that his suffering had meaning, that his sacrifice had been worthwhile. Private Raymond Coley, who had been bleeding to death when Desmond found him on Hacksaw Ridge, visited Desmond in 2005 with his great-grandchildren. "Doc," Coley said, holding the hand of a 4-year-old girl, "this is Emma. She's my great-granddaughter. She wouldn't be here if you hadn't saved me that day. None of us would be here. My 3 children, my 7 grandchildren, my 4 great-grandchildren, we're all here because of you." Desmond looked at the little girl and felt tears stream down his face. This was why God had put him on that cliff. This was why he had endured the abuse, the wounds, the pain. So that lives like Emma's could exist, so that families could continue, so that love could triumph over death. On March 23, 2006, Desmond Doss passed away at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. He was 87 years old. The cause of death was respiratory failure related to his long-standing health issues. He died peacefully, surrounded by family, and secure in his faith that he would soon be reunited with Dorothy and all those who had gone before him. News of Desmond's death spread quickly through the military community and beyond. Tributes poured in from around the world. The men he had saved, now elderly themselves, mourned the loss of the man who had given them their lives. Many of them had stayed in touch with Desmond for over 60 years, maintaining friendships forged in the crucible of war. Desmond's funeral was held at the Collegedale Seventh-day Adventist Church in Tennessee, and it was unlike any military funeral most attendees had ever seen. Over 1,500 people attended, including dozens of the men Desmond had saved and their families. The church overflowed with mourners who wanted to pay their respects to a genuine American hero. Military honors were rendered with full ceremony. A flag-draped casket, a rifle salute, the haunting notes of taps. But the most moving moments came when the men Desmond had saved stood up to speak. One by one, they shared their stories of how Doc Doss had appeared at their darkest moment and given them a future. Glenn Pettis, now 85 years old and using a walker, slowly made his way to the podium. His voice shook with emotion as he spoke. 61 years ago, Desmond Doss saved my life on Hacksaw Ridge. I was 24 years old, had a wife and 2 small children at home. I thought I'd never see them again. But Desmond wouldn't give up on me. He pulled me across that cliff, patched me up, and lowered me to safety. Because of him, I got to go home to my family. I got to watch my children grow up, see my grandchildren born, hold my great-grandchildren. Every good moment I've had in the last 61 years, every Christmas with family, every birthday, every wedding, every birth, all of it happened because Desmond Doss refused to leave me behind on that cliff. Pettis paused, overcome with emotion, then continued. Desmond lived by his principles. He never compromised his faith, not even when everyone told him he was wrong, not even when it would have been easier to give in. He showed all of us what real courage looks like. It's not about carrying the biggest gun or killing the most enemies. Real courage is staying true to what you believe, even when the whole world is against you. Real courage is saving lives when everyone else is taking them. Ralph Baker was the last of the veterans to speak. Now 86 years old, he needed help getting to the podium. When he finally stood before the congregation, he took a moment to compose himself before speaking. I have to tell you something that brings me great shame. During training, I was one of the soldiers who beat Desmond. I hit him, insulted him, did everything I could to make him quit the army. I thought he was a coward. I thought his faith made him weak. I was wrong about everything. Baker's voice broke, and he wiped tears from his eyes before continuing. Desmond saved my life on Guam. He ran through machine gun fire to get to me when I was wounded. The man I had beaten, the man I had called a coward, risked his life to save mine. After that day, I sought him out and apologized. He forgave me immediately without hesitation. We became friends, and he remained my friend for the rest of his life. Desmond taught me something I'll never forget, Baker continued. He taught me that there are many kinds of strength, and that refusing to compromise your principles takes more courage than anything I ever did in combat. He taught me that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge, that compassion is stronger than hatred. He taught me what it really means to follow Christ's teaching to love your enemies. Baker looked at Desmond's casket, his face wet with tears. I wouldn't be standing here today if not for Desmond. My wife, my children, my grandchildren, none of them would exist. And I'm not just grateful for the life he saved. I'm grateful for the lessons he taught me about faith, courage, and what it means to be a good man. Rest in peace, Doc. You earned it. After the funeral, Desmond was buried at the National Cemetery in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with full military honors. His gravestone is simple, bearing his name, his dates of service, and the Medal of Honor insignia. But for those who know his story, that simple stone represents something extraordinary. Proof that one person's unwavering faith and courage can change the world. The story of Desmond Doss lived on after his death, reaching new audiences and inspiring new generations. In 2016, director Mel Gibson released Hacksaw Ridge, a feature film dramatizing Desmond's experiences. The movie was a critical and commercial success, earning multiple Academy Award nominations and introducing millions of people worldwide to Desmond's remarkable story. Veterans who had served with Desmond consulted on the film, ensuring that it accurately portrayed his character and his actions. Many said the movie, despite Hollywood's tendency toward exaggeration, actually understated how incredible Desmond's actions were. "If anything," said one veteran, "the movie doesn't capture just how impossible what he did really was. No one who wasn't there can truly understand the courage it took." The film sparked renewed interest in Desmond's story. Schools began teaching about him in history classes. Military academies studied his actions as an example of exceptional courage under fire. Religious organizations pointed to him as an example of how faith and service could coexist. And young people, trying to understand how to live lives of principle in a complicated world, found inspiration in the story of a man who never compromised his beliefs. Today, Desmond Doss is remembered as one of the most remarkable soldiers in American military history. But his legacy extends far beyond his military service. He proved that courage takes many forms, that strength doesn't always come from weapons, and that faith can sustain a person through the most terrible circumstances imaginable. He proved that treating people with respect and compassion, even those who abuse you, can transform enemies into friends. The soldiers who beat him during training became his brothers in arms because he never responded to their hatred with hatred of his own. He showed that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge, that love is stronger than hate. He proved that you can serve your country without compromising your principles. In an era when many people feel they must choose between their faith and their civic duty, Desmond's story shows that such choices are false. You can be true to your religious convictions while also being a patriot and a hero. Most importantly, Desmond proved that one person, armed only with faith and conviction, can make an extraordinary difference in the world. Those 75 men he saved on Hacksaw Ridge went on to father children, build businesses, serve their communities, and live full lives. Their descendants now number in the hundreds. All of those lives, all of that love and joy and human flourishing exists because one man refused to compromise his principles, even when everyone told him he was wrong. The men of Hacksaw Ridge learned something profound on May 5, 1945. They learned that the soldier they had called a coward was actually the bravest man they would ever know. They learned that faith could be a source of strength, that conviction could sustain a person through hell itself. And they learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, but the courage to save lives when everyone else is taking them. Desmond's favorite Bible verse, the one that sustained him through training, through combat, through decades of pain and disability, was Isaiah 41:10. "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." On Hacksaw Ridge, alone on that cliff top with death all around him, Desmond Doss proved that this promise was true. God gave him strength when he had none left. God protected him when protection seemed impossible. And God used him to save 75 lives that would otherwise have been lost. Desmond Doss never carried a weapon, never fired a shot, never took a human life. Yet he became one of the greatest warriors America has ever produced. His weapon was faith, his ammunition was courage, and his mission was to save lives at any cost. In doing so, he showed the world what true heroism looks like, and his legacy continues to inspire all those who believe that principle is worth fighting for, that faith can move mountains, and that one person truly can change the world.